Hey Meissner makers, it is Wednesday, it's 1 o'clock. That must mean it is time for Wednesday Workshop at 1. I'm Jennifer, and today I'm going to take you through a couple of different ways to deal with something that I'm seeing trending out there, and it's English paper piecing. Now, if you're familiar with English paper piecing, you may be thinking, ooh, are we doing handwork? And for some of you, that's really super exciting, and for others, it's like, yeah, not my thing. Although I like both English paper piecing by hand and by machine, what I want to show you today is a machine technique. After all, we are getting into the summertime, and it's nice to be able to have something that we can do at the machine, get our fix of creativity, and then spend some time outdoors when it is so beautiful. So English paper piecing, if you're not familiar, most of you have probably seen little hexagons, right? Stitched up into a grandmother's flower garden, something along those lines. You see it a lot with vintage type projects. Again, these are starting to trend as well as English paper piecing itself. We're going to deal just with hexes today. If you're looking at this thinking, how would I stitch this by machine? That doesn't look like it's going to be much fun. I promise you, this is going to be easy, 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 and extremely accurate. So what we're going to talk about is how to cut these, how to baste them to the papers. That's why it's called English paper piecing. It's a fabric basted to a shape, and then the shapes are joined together to create different units or different segments like we see here. Okay, so bare minimums if you're going to English paper piece by machine. You need a cardstock of some type, right? You need something to hold the shape, and you need shapes. You can search around online. There are downloads for some shapes. There are even papers, pre-cut papers available for some shapes. So you need some cardstock. You will need some fabrics. Now, I would suggest if you've not done English paper piecing before, whether by hand or by machine, make your life a little easier and choose something that's more of an all over or a scattered style print versus something that has that's very directional or has some type of an image or a motif to it. Stick with your random placement fabrics for now. It'll just be a lot easier for you. The other thing that you will want to have is a glue stick. I like both the Quilter Select glue sticks and also the Sewline glue sticks. I don't want to baste by machine if I don't have to. This is fast, it's easy, it's removable. Okay? Then you will also need a very lightweight thread. For English paper piecing, or as I'm going to now refer to it, EPP, because it's faster. For EPP by machine, I like a very, very fine thread. What we're going for here is the look of something that's done by hand, but done by machine, okay? So when you do this by machine, you want it to replicate hand look. We're doing it by machine because it's much faster, okay? And in some cases, depending on our hand sewing abilities, it might even be a little bit more durable if we're stitching this by machine. I like the Quilter Select 80 weight thread. It's a very, very fine thread, and it just disappears into the fabric. That's what we're looking for, again, so those stitches are as invisible as possible. All right, I'm choosing to stitch because, again, I'm doing this by machine, completely by machine, to cut my pieces using my Go Cutter. There is an English paper piecing or an EPP cube that's available through by AccuQuilt, and it does have a number of different EPP shapes in there. And what's nice is that the dies have a fabric die and a coordinating cardstock die. So you can cut everything that you need to be able to create your EPP shapes. You can tell which one is which because it will say on the side, paper or fabric. Also, your paper dies have a hole in the center, and that's for easy removal once you've completed stitching the units. Just like any of the other AccuQuilt dies, you will take your fabric, place it over the die or your cardstock, place it over the die. You do need to use your mat, and then you'll run it through the cutter, and it will accurately cut each of your shapes for you. You can layer up to 6 layers of fabric, 2 layers of cardstock on the cardstock die. Okay, so once I've done that, I will have an assortment of hexagons cut. Okay, so see, I was kind to myself. It's just random scattered prints. This is the wildest one, but it's not so exacting in where each motif is that it's not going to be distracting now that it's cut up into random hexagons. So I have my fabric hexagons. I have my cardstock hexagons. Okay, I failed to mention, if you are working with the Go EPP cube, there is a wonderful book that comes with it that has a number of different block ideas that you can create with the different AccuQuilt dies that are included in that EPP cube. So just something to keep in mind if you are an AccuQuilt user. All right, so once I have these items gathered, I will take my fabric glue stick, and do use a fabric glue stick. It will be much easier to remove everything when you're done. Okay? If we're taking the time to cut all of these out and to create our project, then we do want to work with the materials that are going to ensure that our project is around for longevity. So we'll now take one of our paper or our fabric hexagons, take my paper hexagon, and I'm going to center it, the cardstock over the fabric. And coming down one side of my fabric, I'm going to run my glue stick and roll my fabric over. Then I'm going to come down the adjoining side, roll my fabric over. Now when I start to do the adjoining sides, if things are not laying flat, I will put a little dab of glue where there's an overlap between the prior turn and the next turn of the fabric. As you're pulling the fabrics around, don't pull them super, super tight. Okay, just roll them over as they want to go. If you pull this and you create too much tension on your fabric, your pieces may pucker once you have everything put together. So just a gentle wrapping. And then you will end up with your very fancy hexagon. Okay, so we'll do just a couple of these, and then we'll go to the machine and see how to join them. So again, your fabric is wrong sides up. Get it as close to center, but it doesn't have to be as exact. Roll that fabric over, and then work your way to the next side, the next side, the next side. Really like this Quilter Select glue stick. It's yellow, and so it shows up really nicely on my black cardstock. Okay. All right. Also, there are refills available for these. So you're being environmentally friendly as well. Okay, so we're going to continue. Now, how you choose to lay these out and the colors, sometimes I'll play with my pre-cut fabrics a little bit to see, where I'm going. For your first projects, I would recommend, if you are using the Go Cutter, to stitch up a few of the blocks that are included in the EPP Made Easy book that's available to go along with that cube. All right, so we have our hexagons made. You've made your hexagons either using your Go or another template creation technique that you are aware of. Now let's stitch them together at the machine, because again, we're after instant gratification, to be perfectly honest. So let's take a trip over to the machine and get these hexagons stitched together. Now, the technique for joining each of the units once you have glue basted them to the cardstock is the same. What you want to be planning in your head is what direction do you want to go as you're stitching so that you have the fewest starts and stops. So, for example, if I were stitching row upon row upon row of hexie, I would join them together on their little ends here until I had a row as long as I needed it, and then I would take the next section, create another row, join them this way, and then stitch in a zigzag all the way down the row, connecting the two rows of hexies, right? That would be one method. The stitch type and the way that I sew them will be the same. If I were stitching a more traditional rosette, I would be inclined to almost stitch in a U. So I would start here, I would stitch my way in, across here, up. Now I'm going to have a stop. Then I'm going to come back down to the bottom, go across, go up, come down, cross, etc. The other way you could stitch the rosettes is to join short side, short side, short side, short sides together till you have a ring, then drop the center in and stitch all the way around the center to join the ring to the center. Either way is just fine. There's no hardened set. It's shortest or longest distance without having to stop. And that's true whether you're hand stitching or whether you are machine stitching. All right, so for something like this one, I believe what I did was to join this little diamond to the triangle, to the diamond, work my way to the next point, right? So we have a straight row here, join them to the center section. Again, just lay it out and start to work through the joining in whichever manner gives you the fewest starts and stops. Okay, I talked about thread. We want to use that very fine 80 weight thread so that it doesn't show. Now I have fluorescent orange thread on my machine. I do not recommend that unless you are piecing using fluorescent orange fabric, but I want you to be able to see what's going to happen with the stitch. Use a thread that's going to blend in and be as inconspicuous as possible. Okay. I would also use a fine needle. A 65 or a 70 would be recommended. What we're aiming for is to catch mainly the edge of the fabric, not so much the cardstock. It's not going to hurt anything to stitch through the cardstock by any means, but the smaller the needle and the finer the thread, the less conspicuous your stitching will be. Caution, if you are using size 65 and size 70 needles, do not use your automatic needle threader. Those little tiny hooks do not like to go through the little tiny eye of those needles. So you want to use a supplementary needle threader that you're going to use, that you will thread with manually. Okay, what presser foot do we use? A couple of different options, and this is going to be based on personal preference. I do like a clear foot with a flat bottom. And when I say flat bottom, go and look at some of the presser feet that you have at home, and you'll see that some have ridges or channels that go all the way the length of the bottom of the foot. That's to accommodate thick buildup of stitches that we get on something like a satin stitch, for example, or a heavy decorative stitch, or a lot of thread, like when we're satin stitching. We want to have a presser foot with a nice groove all the way to the back of the foot so that the foot has some place to travel as it's stitching over that buildup of thread. In this case, we're stitching a flat type of a stitch, and we don't need something very heavy, and what I really want is for my presser foot to be as secure at the top of my fabrics, between my fabrics and the bed of my machine as is possible. This particular foot does have a red marking down through the center, so when I'm joining my pieces, I will align that red mark where the join is, right? And lots of different presser foot choices depending on your machine brand. So you want to look for those landmarks on the foot versus looking for a specific type of a foot. The other type of foot that works well is an edge joining style foot. This one will have a wall or a guide of some kind in the middle of the foot. We're not looking for a guide on the sides. It needs to be in the center of the foot, because again, that gives you a visual when you are placing your two units together. That guide rides right between the two, the joint, okay? It will push them apart ever so slightly, which can be nice depending on the stitch that you're using. A little bit of play in there is okay. It'll keep it from being too tight, and once you remove the papers when the project is done, then the fabric is just going to melt into itself. Okay. Now an edge joining foot also, not only does it have a guide in the middle, but you want one that's open in the needle area so that you can move the needle from side to side or use something like a zigzag stitch or a bridging stitch. Okay. So for today, I'm going to choose the flat clear foot to join our pieces together. I've selected a basic zigzag stitch. You can use a zigzag stitch, you can use a bridging stitch, you can use a feather stitch. Bridging stitches and feather stitches are nothing more than a stitch that's going to come down straight, bounce to the right, to the left, and down, to the right, to the left, and down. And so what will happen with your bridging stitches is your needle will come in between the two units. That's where it comes down straight. It'll bounce out to the right to catch one unit, to the left to catch the other. It's going to stitch in the air between, then to the right, to the left, in the air, to the right, to the left, and the air. Okay? So that's going to be a nice invisible finish for you. If your machine doesn't have that type of a stitch, you can also use a zigzag stitch, and that's what I'm going to use today. Again, don't use fluorescent orange thread unless your project is fluorescent orange. I'm going to start right on the edge. You don't need to worry about Y seams or any type of seam allowance. You're simply joining all of your units together with EPP. Okay, the seam allowances are what's wrapped to the back. Now I have already kind of played with this just a little bit and adjusted. And if you have a machine that has either a freehand system or a pivot function, you'll want to use that as you're aligning everything. Okay, I've made my stitch width relatively narrow. I just need for it to bite the fabric on each side. And your stitch length doesn't need to be really long, doesn't need to be really short. I know that's a very specific stitch length to use. Think about if you were hand sewing and you were whipping these stitches together, what the distance would be. So I'm going to go with about a 1.5 for my stitch length and about a 2 for my stitch width. You will want a couple of practice pieces that you test this out to make sure that your machine and your units, that size will work. In fact, I think we're going to narrow that up just a hair. Nope, not lengthen it, narrow it. Just want to catch each side of my pieces, but you do need to catch them enough that they're not going to pull apart. Okay, so I've joined the two hexagons together. Now in real life, don't yank this out like I've just done. I'm going to then put my center here. In real life, you would trim your thread tails like we'll do now. Place that center of my flower. Now remember, we want to stitch the longest travel distance. So when I place this in here, I'm going to sew this way and this way. And we'll trim those threads so this looks beautiful. Okay, our center butts right in. When we get to the corner, we want to stop with our needle down, rotate the unit, and continue to stitch. At this point, pop in the next unit. And stitch. Okay, from here, I would grab the next unit and I would stitch down and across. We'd have to stop and then come back and stitch here. So we'll do one more. I think you get to, oh, you know what? What's even better, all right, we're going to stitch here to here, then we'll come back and catch that little edge. Sometimes as you lay them down, you find a better direction to go. pivot feature really makes it nice as you're turning those corners. So you can see how our unit is starting to take shape. Now, once these are done, what do you do with them? It depends what you're making, right? A traditional grandmother's flower garden, you would create all of your units, and then oftentimes these are then appliqued to a base fabric. You could actually applique this to your base using the same little stitch that we just used, just picking into the edge of your hexie and out into the base, into the hexie, out into the base, okay? Now, once this is done, what do? Resist the temptation to remove the papers until the whole piece is completed. If you start removing papers now because you want to see how did it work, did it do what it was supposed to do, you'll find that yes, it did, but it will be very difficult to continue joining anywhere that you've started removing papers. So resist the urge. Now, because they have those lovely little holes in them, you can take your, I would start with tweezers or something along those lines, stick them up into that little hole, and then just peel the paper away. I do keep my hand on the stitches, or my thumb on the stitches, and pull the paper. Okay? We don't want to pull so hard that we rip any of the stitches. Chances are good that you're going to have a little bit of paper caught up in that stitching area. The bulk of it's going to come right out. Any little bits that might be living up in there, over time, they're going to wash away. I wouldn't worry too much over them. So there we go. It's been removed. Okay? In real life, you have appliqued, or you're ready to applique this to something at this point. All right. So there you have it. English paper piecing by machine. We hope to see you next week. As always, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or things that you would like to see in an upcoming edition of Wednesday Workshop at 1, please make sure that you email us at info@meissnersewing.com.